Between the breath of one universe and the sigh of another, there existed a silence older than any spoken language, deeper than any measured void. It was the silence of walls that had stood since the first shaping of existence, walls built not of stone or steel but of law, of principle, of the quiet agreement that certain worlds must never touch. For countless eons those walls had held. Galaxies had risen and burned within their separate cradles. Civilizations had ascended and vanished, each convinced its stars were the only stars, each unaware that just beyond the veil of its sky, another reality turned in a rhythm that mirrored its own. Yet on this night, in a place that was neither place nor moment, that ancient silence began to tremble. Somewhere in the space between what was real and what was possible, two tides drifted toward each other. They did not know they were tides. They did not know they were drifting. They only carried within them the ordinary weight of their histories, the small triumphs and old wounds of countless lives. And yet, together, they held enough gravity to bend the fabric of the multiverse. The first tide belonged to a world of mutants, a world where a green island called Krakoa had risen from the sea and offered a fragile promise to a people who had been hunted for as long as they had drawn breath. There, on that island, the dead returned through quiet ritual, and children who had once trembled beneath the shadow of sentinels now walked without fear beneath a merciful sun. Peace was still a young thing there, uncertain of its footing, but it was peace nonetheless, and its faint light shimmered across the surface of that reality, like dew waiting for morning. The second tide belonged to a world that had been taught how thin the line between hero and horror could be. It was an Earth still nursing the fresh scars of a betrayal that had shaken every belief its people once held. Cecil Stedman ruled its shadows with a weary, calculating patience, watching the sky for the next inevitable fall. Its heroes bled openly. Its cities remembered the sound of a father's fist against a son's ribs, and the pavement of its streets still whispered of the day a train had been torn in half. Hope survived there, but it did not flourish. It clung, small and stubborn, in the corners where mothers still kissed their children goodnight and young men in blue and yellow suits still promised to try. Neither reality knew of the other. Neither had any reason to look for the other. Yet something between them was waking, and it had been waiting for a very long time. In her quiet madness, half a multiverse away, a woman in a red coronet grieved for children who had never truly lived. Her sorrow was not ordinary. Her sorrow bent probability, unraveled cause, and sent tremors through structures that only gods should have been able to touch. She did not know that her grief had begun to seep beyond her own borders, threading itself through the seams of neighboring worlds like blood into water. In another corner of the void, a laboratory hidden within a Viltrumite outpost worked in ruthless silence upon an experiment that its creators would never live to complete. They had sought to weaponize alternate timelines, to reach into parallel histories, and pluck from them versions of themselves already victorious. Their arrogance was a marvel. Their failure was a catastrophe. What they released into the multiverse was not a weapon but a wound, a thin, bleeding fissure that reached hungrily toward the nearest sorrow it could find. It found the Scarlet Witch. It found her grief. It braided itself into her weeping, and together they tore something open. On Krakoa, at the very moment the fissure kissed the veil, Charles Xavier lifted his head from a book he had not truly been reading. He sat alone in a small stone chamber, the scent of new flowers drifting through an open arch, and for a long instant he did not move. Something had shivered across the surface of his mind, delicate as a moth against glass. He was a telepath who had walked the corridors of countless thoughts, who had touched the dreams of billions, and yet this sensation belonged to no living voice. It was the tremor of a wall thinning, of a door opening in a house where no doors should exist. He rose, slowly, one hand steadying himself against the arm of his chair, and he listened with a stillness that felt almost like prayer. In the far distance of his awareness, he heard a sound like a bell struck underwater, and for the first time in many years, Charles Xavier felt afraid without knowing why. Half a universe away, above a city of glass and iron, a young man in blue and yellow drifted through a cold Chicago wind. Mark Grayson had learned to love the sound of his own breathing at altitude, the muted hush of the world beneath his boots, the way clouds parted around him like curtains around a stage. He had also learned to hate what came with the flight, the memory of a father who had smiled and lied, of a fist that had broken his ribs in the middle of a crowded street. Tonight, however, something new was troubling him. He had been rising in a slow spiral above Lake Michigan when he felt it. A peculiar shudder that had no place in the physics his father had drilled into him. It was not wind. It was not gravity. It was as if the sky itself had drawn a breath and forgotten how to release it. He hovered, listening, his heart lifting into that familiar tightness that came before every disaster. Below him, the city glimmered on, oblivious. Cars threaded through streets. Windows glowed with the quiet lives of strangers. Somewhere, a woman laughed on a rooftop. Somewhere else, a child slept beneath a poster of a smiling superhero he had never actually met. Mark closed his eyes and tried to isolate the sensation, but it slipped away from him. Elusive as a name half remembered. He thought of calling Cecil, then hesitated, unsure of what he would even report. A strange feeling in the air was not an emergency, not yet. Still, the memory of that shudder clung to him as he began to descend, and he could not shake the impression that somewhere, in a direction he could not name, the universe had just cleared its throat. Back on Krakoa, Xavier had already reached the doors of Cerebro, his steps quicker than they had been in years. He did not summon the others. There was, as yet, nothing to tell. He needed to see for himself. He needed to be certain. When the helmet closed around his head and the darkness gave way to that familiar cathedral of lights, he searched for the tremor and found instead a blank spot in the constellation of minds he had catalogued all his life. A blank spot where a moment ago there had been nothing at all. It was not the absence of thought. It was the shape of a place where thought had never existed within this reality, now suddenly imprinting itself upon the map. Another world was pressing itself against the underside of his own. Then, without warning, the sky above upstate New York opened. It was not a flash. It was not a roar. It was a long, slow, tearing sound, like fabric giving way beneath patient hands. Above a stretch of quiet forest, high in the darkness where only satellites should have moved, a seam appeared. Light bled from it, silver and violet, and something that had no name in either universe. Trees below bent as if in reverence. Birds took flight in silent panic. And through that widening seam, small and screaming and utterly alone, a young girl tumbled from a place that had loved her into a place that did not yet know her name. She was 15, perhaps 16. Her hands were burning with a soft blue fire she could not control. Her eyes were wide with the terror of one who had been ordinary only a week before. She had manifested in the middle of her bedroom, and she had fallen through the floor of her world. Now she fell through the sky of another, and beneath her, unseen and unaware, a country that had never learned the word mutants slept on beneath its worried stars. The rift did not close behind her. It waited, patient as an open mouth, and above it, the wound in the multiverse began at last to smile. Dawn came without warning to a mansion that no longer belonged to the ground beneath it. The X-Men had gone to sleep in one world and awakened in another, though not one of them yet understood what had happened. The first sign came with the light. It slanted through the tall windows of the mansion at an angle that did not match the season, thinner and colder, as if the sun itself had grown suspicious. Storm was the first to rise, drawn from her chambers by the taste of the wind. She stepped onto the balcony with the calm of a woman who had wrestled hurricanes, and yet within a single breath the calm left her. The horizon was wrong. The trees were wrong. The very shape of the clouds argued with everything she had ever known about the sky above Westchester. She did not scream. She did not call out. She simply closed her eyes and listened. And what the wind told her filled her with the quiet certainty that they had traveled somewhere they were never meant to be. Within minutes, she was standing at the door of Charles Xavier's study. And within an hour, every senior member of the school had gathered around the long oak table in the war room. Cyclops stood at the head, arms folded, his visor catching the strange new light. Jean Grey sat beside him, one hand pressed lightly to her temple, her face pale with the effort of holding back 100 whispering intuitions. Beast was already at the console, his fingers moving with the practiced ferocity of a man who preferred data to dread. Wolverine leaned against the far wall with the loose readiness of a predator, his nostrils flaring. Nightcrawler perched on the sill, tail flicking. Rogue crossed her arms tightly, gloves drawn to her wrists. Kitty. Pride stood between them all, small and steady, doing what she had learned to do best, listening. Xavier addressed them without ceremony. He spoke of the tremor he had felt in the night, of the impossible reading Cerebro had shown him, of the way the psychic map of the world had rearranged itself while they slept. He spoke plainly, because there was no gentle way to tell one's family that the ground beneath their feet was not the ground they knew. Beast confirmed it in a voice hushed by wonder and worry. Atmospheric composition matched Earth almost exactly, he said, and yet the trace elements were subtly wrong. The isotope ratios of the upper stratosphere carrying signatures he had never before catalogued. There were also strange residues at the edges of the readings, faint but unmistakable. Particles resembling combat radiation of a kind that no engine on Earth had ever produced. Something powerful had fought here, and not long ago, something powerful still fought here. Cerebro, when at last it was engaged, delivered the most chilling revelation. It could not find Krakoa. It could not find Genosha. It could not find the small mutant colonies of the Australian outback, the Alaskan wilderness, the hidden districts of Mumbai and Marseille. It could not find any mutants at all beyond the walls of the mansion itself. For a long moment no one spoke. Kitty's hand drifted to her mouth. Rogue turned her face aside. Even Wolverine's snarl softened into something that resembled grief. To be alone in the world was one thing. To be the last of one's kind in a world one did not recognize was another entirely. Outside those walls, however, the mansion had not gone unnoticed. Several miles away, in a fortified compound buried beneath the ordinary green of a state park, Cecil Stedman was already on his third cup of coffee. He had been informed of the anomaly within minutes of its appearance, and by dawn his analysts had confirmed the impossible. A building, complete and intact, had materialized overnight upon a hillside that had been empty the evening before. Satellite imagery showed no construction. Radar had recorded no approach. The soil around its foundations had been displaced as if the structure had been pressed into the earth by an unseen hand. Cecil watched the surveillance feed with the flat, exhausted expression of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by the impossible and had instead learned only to be wary of it. He gave 3 orders in quick succession: contain the perimeter, assemble the Guardians, and, with an almost weary sigh, send Donald. Donald Ferguson arrived at the mansion in a black transport with an escort of 6 armored vehicles. Behind him, in a second transport, came the Guardians of the Globe, or what remained of them in the aftermath of every recent tragedy. Rex Splode chewed a match between his teeth. Duplicate divided herself in silence. Immortal watched the mansion with the measured calm of a man who had lived long enough to understand that patience saved more lives than force. Monster Girl stayed in the transport, her small frame perched at the window. Curious, they did not knock. They surrounded. They took positions with a professionalism that would have impressed even Cyclops. Yet before Donald had raised his hand to signal an approach, the great doors of the mansion opened, and Charles Xavier rolled out into the pale morning light, unarmed, unaccompanied, and unafraid. Cecil arrived by helicopter 20 minutes later, and it was on the mansion's front steps that the 2 men met for the first time. Neither of them extended a hand. Both understood at once what the other was. Xavier saw the layered burdens of a man who had bargained with monsters, who had reanimated the dead to save the living, who carried 1,000 secrets so heavy they had bent his shoulders inward. Cecil saw a telepath dressed like a scholar, and behind the scholar's calm eyes he sensed the pressure of a mind capable of unraveling every failsafe he had ever engineered. It was not a comfortable recognition for either of them, yet neither retreated. Instead they spoke. They spoke of thresholds, of cooperation, of temporary understandings. Xavier explained, in the careful language of a diplomat, that his people had come here by no choice of their own, and that they wished only to understand where they were. Cecil explained, in the careful language of a general, that his world had already been broken more than once, and that trust would be earned in careful inches, not offered in generous yards. Their words were polite. Their silences were not. In the quiet spaces between sentences, each man measured the other, and each knew that he was being measured in turn. Xavier felt the walls Cecil had built inside his own mind, walls of routine and denial, and he did not press against them. Cecil noticed the way Xavier declined to look at certain of the Guardians, as if respecting a boundary he had not been given, and he found himself grudgingly impressed. When at last they parted, no alliance had been signed, no treaty struck. Only a fragile understanding that the 2 of them would speak again, and soon. It was, in its way, the beginning of an uneasy peace, but Xavier had lived long enough to know that peace between clever men often began as the quiet before a much longer war. Around them, the world had begun to notice. Reporters swarmed the perimeter road. Drones buzzed the treetops. The images of the mansion, so out of place upon its wounded hillside, spread across the news networks of the Invincible universe within the hour, and by lunchtime the ordinary citizens of that earth were staring at their screens with the same tired unease with which they had learned to greet every new impossibility. Some were curious, some were frightened. Most simply felt the small, familiar ache of realizing that the sky above them had once again become a place from which strange things might fall. In coffee shops and living rooms and school hallways, ordinary people asked one another who these newcomers were, and no one had an answer. They did not look like guardians. They did not fly. Some of them, according to the earliest footage, had blue fur or golden eyes or skin that shimmered. A shopkeeper in Detroit whispered the word alien. A teacher in Atlanta whispered the word threat. And in a small apartment above a bookstore in Chicago, a young woman with wide eyes whispered the word beautiful and did not know why. Back inside the mansion, the young mutants gathered near the tall windows and watched the world watching them. Kitty Pryde stood with her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Nightcrawler placed one three-fingered hand on the glass and murmured a small prayer in a language none of the others spoke. Rogue kept her distance, unwilling to be seen. Somewhere above them, in a distant cloud too high for any camera to catch, a lone figure hung motionless in the air, arms crossed, cape drifting in a wind that touched nothing else. The figure did not descend. It did not approach. It simply watched, patient and quiet, as the shadow of a returning father fell for the first time across the mansion's silent lawn. He had returned to Earth the way sorrow returns to a widow, quietly, without announcement, and with no expectation of welcome. Mark Grayson had been many things across the long span of his life: soldier, conqueror, husband, father, traitor, exile, and now, in a private accounting he permitted no one else to witness, mourner. He had come back because the rift had called to him. He had felt it days before it opened, felt it in the marrow of his Viltrumite bones, felt it in the faint ache behind his eyes that only the presence of an unfinished experiment could produce. He knew the shape of Empire science. He knew the smell of its failures, and when he first glimpsed the shimmering seam over New York, he had understood with a cold, sinking certainty that this wound was familiar. Somewhere, someone within the Empire had tried to touch what should not be touched, and something older had answered. He hovered above the mansion for a long time before he descended, weighing the risk of what he was about to do. He was not a stranger to being feared. Fear was a garment he had worn for so long that it had begun to feel like skin. Yet fear from these particular strangers unsettled him in a way he could not quite name. He had watched them from above for hours, cataloging their movements, their formations, the quiet, familial ease with which they placed themselves near one another. They were soldiers, yes, but soldiers of an unfamiliar kind. They did not stand as Viltrumites stood. They did not stand as Cecil's guardians stood. They stood the way a chosen family stands, close together, ready to bleed for one another rather than for a cause. It disarmed him more than any weapon could have. Wolverine was the first to sense him. He had been sitting on the low stone wall behind the mansion, a cigar clamped in his teeth, watching the tree line with a stillness that made even Storm move quietly around him. He did not need to see the intruder to know he had come. He smelled him first. It was a scent unlike any he had cataloged in a lifetime of cataloged scents. Iron and ash and something else. Something that had walked across too many battlefields for too many centuries. Logan spat the cigar into the grass, rose, and began to move without a word. The confrontation broke like a storm across the western lawn. Nolan had descended slowly, hands empty, cape drifting in a wind that only touched him, and he had barely set his boots upon the grass when a blur of denim and adamantium collided with his chest. There was no negotiation. There was no offer of speech. Wolverine had struck him with the terrible instinctive force of a predator who had recognized, from a distance of centuries, the shape of a creature that had killed. Nolan absorbed the strike, staggered a half step, and then, almost gently, backhanded Logan into a tree so hard that the trunk split along its length. Logan rose, wiped blood from his lip, and came again. The battle that followed was catastrophic in the way only mismatched battles can be. Adamantium claws sang against Viltrumite skin. Sparks flew where no sparks should ever have flown. Logan drew blood, real blood, the impossible bright red of a body older than most nations, and Nolan looked down at the wound as if it were an old acquaintance he had not seen in some time. He did not smile. He did not sneer. He only inclined his head, the smallest of respects, and struck back with a controlled savagery that sent Logan skidding across 30 yards of torn earth. Behind him, Storm rose into the sky, her eyes whitening, her hair lifting, and the clouds above the mansion churned into a bruised black spiral. Lightning fell in a solid pillar upon Nolan's shoulders, and for one long, blazing instant, even a Viltrumite could not shrug it aside. His knee bent, his teeth clenched. He looked up into the storm and did not curse it. Jean Grey came next, but she came not with force, but with the quiet intrusion of a mind reaching toward a mind. She had meant only to touch him lightly, to skim the surface, to learn his intentions. What she found instead very nearly broke her. His memories were not memories in the ordinary sense. They were catalogs, cities without number, ended by his own hands. Species he could no longer name because he had never bothered to learn their languages before their extinction. And beneath it all, threaded through every century, a single unbroken cord of duty, cold and pure and terrible. She recoiled with a gasp and staggered backward into Cyclops' arms. And it was in that moment, seeing her pain, that Charles Xavier at last emerged from the mansion. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hand. He simply spoke a single word inside every mind on that lawn, and the word was enough. Enough. It struck Nolan with more weight than the storm had, because it was not a command of the body, but a command of the deeper self. And even a Viltrumite, trained since childhood to resist all forms of coercion, could not immediately shake off the resonance of a telepath as old and disciplined as Charles Xavier. Nolan stilled. Logan, 3 claws already lifted for another strike, halted mid-stride. Storm allowed the clouds to gently. Nightcrawler, poised on the roof, exhaled. The battle ended not because either side had won, but because a wiser voice had asked them to stop, and both sides, in their exhaustion, had remembered how. They spoke afterward on the terrace behind the mansion, Xavier in his chair, Nolan standing with his arms folded, the last light of the strange sun falling across them both. It was not a comfortable conversation. It was not meant to be. Nolan spoke first of the Empire. He spoke of Viltrum, of what it had done to worlds, of what it had done to him, of the long, slow rot that begins when a soldier stops questioning his orders. He did not seek sympathy. He did not offer excuses. He offered only truth, and there is a particular weight to truth, spoken by a man who has finally stopped lying to himself. Xavier listened without interruption. When at last he spoke, he did so quietly, as one father to another, and he spoke of mutants, of children born feared, of the burden of a dream that had never quite been realized, of the quiet failure of a teacher who had watched too many of his students fall in a war they had not chosen. For a long while, neither man spoke. The lawn beyond them was quiet. The mansion behind them held its breath. 2 patriarchs stood in the failing light, each carrying the ashes of the sons and daughters he had failed, each recognizing in the other the strange kinship of the wounded. Nolan looked at Xavier at last and said, in a voice that had been softened by something he did not care to name, that he had come to warn them. Xavier did not interrupt. Nolan spoke of the rift. He spoke of the failed Viltrumite experiment, of the way the Empire had reached into other timelines seeking easy victories, of the way something had answered from the far side of that reach. He said the rift was not an accident. He said that something, somewhere, wanted these 2 universes to bleed together, and that whatever wanted such a thing was patient, and old, and hungry. Xavier asked, gently, if Nolan knew what it was. Nolan shook his head. Not yet. But there was a name, he said, a name that had begun to appear in the intercepted communications of the Empire's inner circle, a name spoken with reverence by men who reverenced nothing else. He said the name aloud only once, and the syllable seemed to hang upon the air longer than it should have. Thrag. Xavier repeated it silently within his own mind, filing it beside 1,000 other threats he had learned to remember. Nolan looked at him then, one father to another, and he said something that Xavier would carry with him for the rest of his days. He said that whatever came next, the children of both universes would pay the price for the choices of men like them. He said that the only kindness they could offer their children now was to choose more wisely than they had ever chosen before. The sky above the mansion had turned the color of a slow bruise by the time Nolan lifted from the terrace. He rose without a sound, his cape gathering the last of the light, and paused only once to look back at Charles Xavier. Nothing passed between them but a silence too heavy for language. Then he was gone, a small dark shape ascending into the growing dark, and Xavier remained upon the terrace long after the mansion behind him had darkened its windows. Storm found him there hours later, still watching the sky. She did not ask him what had been said. She only rested a hand upon his shoulder, and the two of them stood together in the quiet, listening to a world that had suddenly grown a great deal larger and a great deal more dangerous than either of them had known that morning. The young are always the first to find each other. It is the quiet mercy of every story that while the elders draw their maps and count their soldiers, the children slip past the sentries and meet in the space between the walls. So it was on the third night after the rift, when a boy in blue and yellow met a girl who could walk through walls and a devout blue-skinned soul who had learned to smile in 3 languages. Their meeting was not planned. It was carved out of chaos, as most true meetings are, and it began, as such things so often do in the Invincible universe, with a scream. The scream came from a plaza in downtown Chicago, where a girl of perhaps 12 had begun, without warning, to manifest. Her mother had been buying her a paper cup of hot chocolate. Her father had been tying his shoe. The plaza had been full of the ordinary music of a winter evening, footsteps and laughter and the distant chatter of a busker's guitar, when the child's eyes had begun to glow. The eruption that followed cracked the marble beneath her feet, sent benches flying, shattered the great glass window of the cafe behind her. She rose into the air 3 feet, her small hands opening and closing helplessly, ribbons of white fire spilling from her palms in patterns she did not understand. She was not attacking anyone. She was, quite simply, breaking. The Guardians of the Globe were dispatched within minutes. Cecil, watching from his command center, gave the standard order for an unknown metahuman event: containment first, neutralization if containment failed. Yet the words neutralization if containment failed had, in the Invincible universe, a specific and often terrible meaning, and it was in the seconds between the order and its execution that everything changed. Mark Grayson, patrolling above the lake, arrived first. He landed lightly on the shattered plaza, one hand already raised, calling for the crowd to move back. Behind him, out of a small purple flash and a puff of brimstone that smelled faintly of incense, Nightcrawler appeared with Kitty Pryde clinging to his arm. They had come the moment Cerebro had registered the new signature. They had come quite simply because a child was frightened, and that had always been reason enough. The standoff formed within seconds. Rex Splode landed on one side of the plaza with a grenade already glowing in his palm. Duplicates spread into a half-dozen mirrored selves along the surrounding rooftops. Immortal descended, patient and calm, but his eyes were already measuring angles. On the other side, Kitty phased herself between the child and the nearest weapon, her body flickering translucent, her face steady. Nightcrawler crouched beside the girl, murmuring something in German that no one else could hear. And Mark, caught in the middle, stood with his arms slightly raised, palms open, looking from one side to the other with a growing horror that he did not yet have a word for. Cecil's voice buzzed in his earpiece, calm, clipped and unrelenting, ordering the Guardians to advance. He said no. It was a small word. It was a young word. Yet Mark Grayson had learned in the past year the terrible cost of unquestioning obedience, and something in him had grown too weary to obey. He said it again, louder, and stepped between the Guardians and the mutants. Rex swore. Immortal narrowed his eyes. Kitty, without lowering her guard, allowed her mouth to shape the smallest of surprised smiles. The child hovered in the air behind them, sobbing now, her small body trembling with the effort of holding back a fire she could not name. Nightcrawler placed one 3-fingered hand upon her ankle, whispered, closed his eyes, and in a flash of purple smoke, the two of them were gone. Kitty phased sideways through a Guardian Ordnance drone that had begun to descend from the rooftop, laying her palm briefly upon its casing so that it fell harmlessly through the pavement into the sewer below. Mark stood alone in the center of the plaza, the wind of Nightcrawler's departure still curling around him. and looked at Rex Splode with an expression that was neither anger nor apology. He said, quietly, that they were going to have a conversation before anyone else got hurt. He said it in the voice of a boy who was, day by day, becoming a man. Rex, to his credit, lowered his hand. The grenade dimmed. Immortal exhaled. Somewhere, in the safety of the mansion's medical wing, a child was being wrapped in a blanket by a fanged priest who murmured that she was safe now. Safe. That no one here would hurt her. And the child, who had not been safe in a very long time, allowed herself to weep against his shoulder. Later that night, Mark returned to the mansion at Xavier's quiet invitation. He came alone. He came in ordinary clothes. He came with the sheepish uncertainty of a young man who had never been to a stranger's dinner table without his mother nudging him forward. He was met at the great oak doors by Kitty Pryde, who wore a sweater 2 sizes too large and held 2 mugs of cocoa, one of which she placed in his hand without asking if he wanted it. She led him through the halls, past classrooms and libraries and rooms filled with laughter and rooms filled with pain, and she told him quietly about the children who lived here. She told him about the ones who had come from good families and the ones who had come from families that had turned them away. She told him what it was to grow up hunted for being what one was, to know from the age of 10 that there were people in the world who would want you dead, not for what you had done, but for what you had been born as. Mark listened. He did not interrupt. He drank his cocoa, and he listened, and when they at last sat together on the wide stone steps behind the mansion, he began, hesitantly, to speak. He told her about his father. He told her about the day the train had come apart in his father's hands. He told her what it had felt like to be raised on a lie so beautiful that unlearning it had felt like drowning. He told her, in words he had never spoken to another living soul, what it was to grow up worshipping a monster. Kitty did not interrupt him either. She did not offer platitudes. She only listened, and once, briefly, she reached out and rested her hand upon his, and neither of them spoke of it. When they parted at the doors, they did so as friends, and both of them knew, in the way the young sometimes do, that a bridge had just been built that neither of them would ever be willing to burn. Elsewhere in the mansion, another kind of bridge was being built. In the basement laboratory, Hank McCoy leaned over a bank of humming instruments beside a slim, unassuming figure in a metal suit whose eyes flickered behind a smooth blue visor. Robot had come at Cecil's suggestion, sent nominally to observe, but the moment he had seen the equipment beast was assembling, all pretense of observation had fallen away. Within an hour, the 2 of them were arguing in equations. Within 2, they were laughing. Within 3, they had begun to sketch upon the same blackboard, each finishing the other's proofs, each rolling his eyes when the other used what he considered outdated notation. Between them, on a screen glowing with a slow, hypnotic pulse, the dimensional physics of the rift began to reveal themselves for the first time. It was not natural, they agreed. It was not accident. It had been coaxed, encouraged, whispered into being by something that understood how universes ached, and that had known, precisely, where to press. They did not yet know what to call the presence they sensed behind the numbers. They knew only that the deeper they looked, the more the numbers themselves seemed to look back. Beast, halfway through a cup of very strong tea, remarked that in all his years of study he had never felt an equation to be quite so patient. Robot, whose face had been engineered to conceal expression, said nothing for a long moment, then admitted, with an odd flatness, that he found himself, for the first time, uncertain. The 2 of them worked on in silence after that, and above them, unheard, the mansion settled into a rare and fragile peace. By the time Mark returned home, the streets of Chicago had quieted. His mother was waiting for him at the kitchen table, a cup of tea between her hands, her face pale beneath the yellow light. He knew before she spoke. He always knew. Debbie Grayson looked up at her son with the tired affection of a woman who had already survived too many revelations, and she told him, gently, that Cecil had called. Another rift had opened, she said. This one had not brought children. This one had not brought teachers. This one, according to the very first grainy photographs already flooding the world's screens, had brought machines. Enormous purple and silver, walking upon the horizon with slow, deliberate steps. And their eyes, she said, were glowing red. They came in silence at first. That was the worst of it. The great purple giants stepped from the second rift, as if they had every right to be there. their movements too precise for machines their size, their eyes burning with a quiet crimson patience. There were no war cries. There were no engines. There was only the slow, steady thunder of their footfalls and the way birds vanished from the trees ahead of them as if by prior agreement. The first images to reach the world's news feeds came from a startled commuter on the elevated train, his phone shaking in his hand, his voice caught somewhere between disbelief and prayer. He had said only one word before the camera fell. He had said, God. The Sentinels had arrived. They wore the same coloring the X-Men remembered from 100 nightmares. Purple armor plated over silver joints. The great red visors that seemed to look through skin and bone alike. Yet these were not the Sentinels of the mutants' home reality. They were bigger. Their joints were fused with a metal that shimmered faintly gold in the sunlight. A metal that Beast, watching from the mansion's telescope, would identify within minutes as Viltrumite alloy. Their algorithms, when analyzed later, would show layered lines of code from at least 3 different technological traditions, welded together by a hand that clearly understood all of them. Someone had built these Sentinels for this Earth. Someone had known the mutants were coming and had prepared. Cyclops led the response with the calm ferocity that had made him, over the years, the quiet spine of every X-Men formation. He divided his forces before the transports had even lifted from the mansion lawn. Storm took the sky with Rogue at her side, one to command the heavens and the other to absorb what the heavens could not deflect. Nightcrawler paired with Kitty Pryde, Teleporter and Phaser, meant to move quickly through the Sentinels' blind spots. Wolverine went where Wolverine always went, into the thickest of it. Beast, back at the mansion, coordinated with Robot in a whirlwind of scrolling data, feeding real-time analysis to every combatant in the field. The Guardians of the Globe joined them in the sky above Chicago within minutes. Rex Splode arrived cursing. Immortal arrived silent. Monster Girl, small and fierce, arrived already snarling. And Mark Grayson, who had not slept, arrived first. The battle began beneath a slate-gray sky above Michigan Avenue, and it did not end quickly. The Sentinels moved with the coordinated grace of a single mind. When one raised its arm, all raised their arms. When one adjusted its stance, all adjusted. Cyclops, seeing this, ordered his people to break their line of sight to one another, to force the machines to divide their processing between multiple targets. The order saved lives in the first minutes. Storm called down a curtain of black clouds so thick that the Sentinels' optical scanners fumbled for half a second before adapting, and in that half second, Rogue tore into the nearest of them with the strength of a stolen Viltrumite touch, driving her fist through its chest plating with a howl of borrowed thunder. Mark hit another from above, straight through the shoulder, twisting mid-strike to shear off its arm. The severed limb fell into the street below, crushing a taxi that had, mercifully, been evacuated an hour earlier. Yet the Sentinels learned. That was their oldest and most terrible virtue. Within minutes they had begun to adapt. Storm's clouds thinned as the Sentinels adjusted their sensors. Rogue's next punch met a plate that had, somehow, hardened at the very moment of impact. Mark's shearing strikes were parried twice, then a third time. Cyclops, watching this in cold horror, called out new orders. But even as he spoke, he knew that the machines were learning faster than his people could improvise. Somewhere within the flock, a shared code was rewriting itself in real time, adjusting for adamantium, for optic blasts, for phasing, for teleportation. It was Beast's voice in his ear that finally spelled out the horror. These Sentinels, he said, were not merely designed to hunt mutants. They were designed to hunt anyone who exceeded human baseline. They read Viltrumite the same as they read X-Gene. To them, hero was a synonym for target. Rex Splode nearly died in the 7th minute of the engagement. He had climbed onto the shoulder of one of the giants, meaning to force an armed detonation into its neural core, when the Sentinel's helmet swiveled with a speed that no machine of that size should have possessed. It struck him aside with the flat of its palm, sent him tumbling through the air toward a jagged edge of shattered building. And it was only Nightcrawler's teleportation, at the very last instant, that plucked him from the sky and dropped him gasping onto the roof of a parking garage 6 blocks away. Rex, holding his cracked ribs, looked up at the fanged blue face bending over him and said the first honest thank you of his life. Nightcrawler smiled, whispered a small blessing, and was gone. Wolverine was less fortunate. He had climbed one of the sentinels with the fury of a man who had spent decades learning to climb such things. But the machine, adapting mid-combat, had rotated a hidden blade from beneath its jaw and swung it in a wide, decapitating arc. There was no time to duck. There was barely time to see it. And then there was Monster Girl, all fury and muscle beneath her small child's face, colliding with the blade in a spray of sparks and blood. She took the hit meant for Logan. She staggered. She fell. Wolverine, howling, caught her before she hit the pavement, and Logan and the tiny warrior girl looked at each other for a long, breathless moment. One predator recognizing another. One soul who had been asked too young to be too much. He carried her from the field with a tenderness he had not shown in years, and she did not remember, afterward, whether she had thanked him. The battle raged for over an hour. Chicago's northern skyline burned in 3 places. The lake itself steamed where the Sentinel's plasma weapons had bored into its surface, and still the machines advanced. It was Xavier, from his chair in the war room, who at last found the pattern. He had been watching the coordinated movements through Beast's screens, watching the algorithms sing to one another, and he had recognized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the wind, the underlying shape of the code. It was not merely mutant hunting protocol. Layered beneath it, quiet as a whispered lullaby, was a piece of code that Xavier had glimpsed only once before, in a classified report that Cecil Stedman had shown him during their very first meeting. It was Global Defense Agency architecture. He did not speak of it at once. He filed the knowledge in a quiet place inside himself, the place where he kept the small betrayals that had to wait for their moment. Instead, he directed Jean Grey to reach into the machines. She did, gently, telepathically, feeling for the seams of their processing, and when she found them, she began to whisper. She did not attack their code. She sang to it. She lulled the learning algorithms into a slow, gentle sleep, a lullaby of the mind that no purely mechanical intelligence had been designed to resist. One by one, across the burning skyline, the great giants began to slow. Their movements grew heavier, their crimson eyes dimmed. Mark, seizing the moment, tore through the nearest of them with a two-handed strike that split it from shoulder to hip, and in the sudden opening that followed, the combined heroes of 2 universes fell upon the enemy at last, with a coordinated fury. The last sentinel fell into Lake Michigan with a hiss of steam that could be heard 3 miles inland. The city, when at last it was quiet, wept the small, unsteady weeping of a place that had learned too well how to grieve. Ambulances threaded the ruins. Volunteers moved through the debris. Somewhere above the smoke, storm allowed her clouds to gently into a soft, cleansing rain, and the ash upon the streets ran together in dark rivers toward the drains. The heroes gathered slowly, one by one, at the edge of the plaza where the first strike had fallen. Kitty phased through a collapsed slab of concrete to sit down beside Mark on the curb. Nightcrawler wrapped a torn coat around Monster Girl's shoulders. Rex, still holding his cracked ribs, allowed Immortal to steady him without complaint. In his command center far below the city, Cecil Stedman watched the final replays in silence. His analysts around him were already congratulating one another, already drafting statements, already preparing the press. Cecil did not speak. He reached, at last, for a small red folder that had lain untouched in his desk drawer for 11 months. He opened it. He looked at the classified specifications inside, at the diagrams of the great purple giants, at the annotations in his own handwriting along the margins. He closed the folder. He set it back inside the drawer. Then he lit a cigarette, blew a slow gray cloud toward the ceiling, and murmured, to no one in particular, that some doors once opened could not be closed without consequence. Above him, unseen, unaware, Charles Xavier was already deciding to open one. The descent was made in silence. Xavier had asked no permission. Jean Grey had asked no explanation. They had entered the elevator together, one man in a chair and one woman in a coat too plain to draw notice, and they had allowed the machinery of the Global Defense Agency to swallow them without protest. The compound itself was carved into the earth beneath a nondescript rise of Virginia hills, layered like the rings of an ancient tree, each level deeper than the last, each colder, each more heavily guarded. Cecil had personally cleared their visit. He had done so with the sort of tight, thin-lipped smile that a general offers when he agrees to show a rival his own war rooms. He was not afraid to show Xavier what lay beneath his feet. He was afraid of what Xavier would see anyway, whether he showed him or not. The upper levels were ordinary enough. Server rooms hummed. Analysts moved between glass-walled offices with quiet purpose. Yet even here, Jean felt the presence of the walls that Cecil had built inside the minds of his people. The little compartments of denial that permitted a soldier to type quarterly reports beside a colleague she believed to be alive. Xavier felt them too. He did not reach into them. He respected, at first, the private architecture of another man's institution. That respect lasted precisely until the fourth level below the surface, when the elevator doors opened upon a corridor lit in the pale, sterile blue that only mausoleums and laboratories share. And Jean Grey, without meaning to, drew in a sharp, whistling breath. They walked between the rows themselves, Jean insisted. Xavier did not argue. In great glass cylinders lining the corridors stood men and women in the tattered remnants of uniforms that any student of recent history would have recognized. Some had been soldiers. Some had been villains. Some had been heroes. All of them had died, and all of them, in the terrible economy of Cecil Stedman's world, had been made to serve again. Their eyes, when the light passed across them, opened and closed with the slow, unwilled rhythm of a body kept just short of finality. Some of them tracked the visitors. Some did not. Xavier's mouth thinned into a line so narrow that it seemed to disappear entirely. Jean's hands at her sides curled slowly into fists. Cecil met them in a small conference room at the corridor's end. He did not offer them coffee. He did not offer them chairs. He stood behind a table, arms folded, waiting. He knew what the walk had done. He had chosen the route himself. Xavier looked at him for a long moment before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was the level, patient voice of a man who had spent his life keeping worse voices in check. He said simply that he understood now. He said it in a way that offered Cecil no forgiveness and no accusation, only the flat statement of a truth that could no longer be avoided between them. Cecil did not deny anything. He never had denied anything to Xavier. That had been, from the very beginning, the strange, uncomfortable respect between them. Instead, he spoke of what he called necessity. He spoke of the day an immortal had lost his temper in a nursery, of the day a guardian had been broken in half in front of his own team, of the day a Viltrumite father had turned a highway into a slaughterhouse. He spoke of a world in which every hero was one bad afternoon away from becoming the worst thing that had ever happened to it, and he asked, without shame, what other kind of insurance a mortal government could possibly hold against beings such as these. Xavier listened without interruption. He always listened. It was one of the disciplines of his long life to hear an opponent to the last syllable before answering. When at last he spoke, he did not raise his voice. He said that Cecil was describing not insurance, but symmetry. He said that once a government began to prepare for the worst version of its heroes, it became itself, the worst version of its own promises. He spoke of a man named Bolivar Trask in another universe, in another life, who had used almost precisely those same words to justify almost precisely those same choices. He spoke of the Sentinels, of their long march through his people's history, of the graveyards they had made of playgrounds. He did not raise his hand. He did not raise his mind. He only asked, gently, whether Cecil had ever considered how easily the language of protection could become the language of persecution. Cecil, to his credit, did not flinch. He said only that he did not have the luxury of dreams. He said that his job began where dreams ended. He said that if the price of Earth's survival was that men like him had to carry the weight of choices men like Xavier could not stomach, then he would carry that weight, and he would do so without seeking forgiveness. He said it in the tired voice of a man who had already made his peace with damnation, and it was that quiet, weary certainty that at last made Xavier's expression change. It was not anger that entered Charles Xavier's face. It was something worse. It was disappointment. Cecil, who had faced down Viltrumites and reanimated murderers without blinking, found himself, for the first time in years, briefly unable to hold another man's gaze. It was Jean who broke the silence, and she nearly broke a great deal more with it. She had drifted, unseen, into one of the connected server nodes while the two men had argued, and there she had found, in a folder of very ordinary title, the records of a research division whose existence Cecil had never mentioned. X-gene mapping, tissue samples taken from the children they had processed on the morning of the mansion's arrival, cross-referencing with Viltrumite alloy specifications. preliminary sketches of what could only be described as breeding protocols. Her phoenix, which had been slumbering for weeks now beneath the surface of her calm, opened one great, molten eye. The room grew warm. The lights above them flickered. Cecil's cigarette, unlit in his hand, wilted at the edge as though someone had held a match beneath it. Jean turned to him slowly, and there was no accusation in her expression, only a terrible, clear grief. She did not need to speak. Cecil saw it in her, and to his credit, he did not look away this time. He met her gaze until Xavier, who had been watching her carefully, placed one hand very gently upon her wrist. He did not command her. He did not restrain her by force. He only touched her, the way a father touches a daughter whose sorrow has begun to overwhelm her, and something in the touch reminded Jean of who she was, and who she had promised to be, and what she had sworn never to become again. The phoenix, reluctantly, closed its eye. The lights steadied. The cigarette in Cecil's hand crumbled into ash. They left the compound without further words. They rose through the elevator in silence, past floor after floor of humming machinery, past the corridors of the reanimated dead, past the young analysts sipping their coffee in the ordinary morning light. When they reached the surface, the sun was setting over the Virginia hills, painting the ridges in a soft, reproachful gold. Xavier's transport waited on the pad. He allowed Jean to walk ahead of him. He looked back once at Cecil, who had come as far as the door but no further, and he inclined his head with a formality that felt almost like an obituary. Cecil returned the gesture, and something passed between them that would take neither of them years to name, though both of them recognized it in that moment. It was the end of a certain kind of trust, not of cooperation perhaps, but of trust. A very specific door had been closed, and neither of them believed it could be opened again. Xavier spoke only once during the flight back to the mansion. He said quietly to Jean that he had spent his entire life believing that governments could be persuaded. He said that he had believed it because he had needed to believe it, because the alternative was too much to carry. He said that he understood now, at last, that no government, in any universe, could be trusted to hold the fate of his people in its hands. Not because governments were evil, not because their servants were monsters, but because the mathematics of survival, when applied to lives that were not one's own, always arrived at the same conclusion. He said it without bitterness. He said it without triumph. He said it as a man says a thing he has spent decades avoiding, and he closed his eyes when he had finished, as though the words themselves had made him older. Jean did not answer him. She was looking out the window at the darkening sky, her cheek pressed lightly against the cool glass, and she was listening to a sound that no one else on the transport could hear. It was faint. It was distant. It came from somewhere very high above the clouds, from a direction she could not have pointed to on any map. It was the sound of engines. Enormous engines. Cold engines. Engines that move through vacuum the way a knife moves through silk. Her breath fogged the glass. Her mouth opened. And then, above the entire eastern hemisphere of the world, a psychic scream tore across every telepathic mind on the continent, and the Viltrumite Empire arrived. They did not come with fire. That was perhaps the most terrible thing about them. Every conqueror the earth had ever known had come with fire, with the crude language of ruin, with the crashing announcement of intent. The Viltrumite Empire came instead with the quiet confidence of a landlord returning to a property he had already decided he owned. Their ships did not descend upon the capitals. They hovered high above them, gleaming, indifferent, arranged in the geometric patterns of a fleet whose captains had done this 1,000 times before and no longer needed to shout. Their heralds did not roar. They walked. They stepped from open portals in the atmosphere and drifted down through clouds, and by the time they touched the streets of Washington and London and Beijing, the world's cameras were already trained upon them in a horrified, silent hush. Thrag himself did not descend at once. That, too, was part of the choreography. He allowed his soldiers to gather first, allowed their calm, unhurried presences to fill the plazas and squares of every major capital, allowed the world's leaders to look at their televisions and understand, in the private silences of their offices, that the small preparations they had made for such a moment were laughably insufficient. Only when the message had been sufficiently delivered, when every network on every continent had ceased its normal broadcast and turned instead to the terrible slow ballet of Viltrumite arrival, did the Grand Regent himself finally deign to appear. He came alone, and he came slowly. His descent lasted nearly a full minute. He arrived in the courtyard of the United Nations, and he arrived on foot, walking the last several steps, as if he had merely strolled from a nearby garden. His armor was polished to a black that swallowed the light. His cape was the deep red of dried blood. His face, beneath the pale hair and the trimmed beard, was calm, curious, almost gentle. He walked to the podium that had been hastily assembled in front of the great glass building, and he waited, patiently, for the human diplomats to remember how to speak. When at last one of them, a woman with steady hands and terrified eyes, approached the microphone beside him, Thrag inclined his head with the courtesy of a man attending a state dinner. He asked, quietly, that she convey his greetings to her species. She did. He then spoke to the world. His voice was not loud. His voice was never loud. Its power lay in its evenness, in the way it moved through the air like a knife through a river, cutting without disturbance. He said that he had come for 2 reasons. He said the first was to reclaim a fugitive of his people, whose crimes against Viltrum had gone unpunished long enough. He said the second was to conduct a peaceful assessment of a recent genetic phenomenon that had appeared upon this earth, one whose potential fascinated the scientists of his empire. He said that neither of these matters required violence. He said that the Viltrumite Empire had come as observers, as elder brothers, as, in his own precise word, gardeners. He smiled when he said gardeners, and something about the smile, mild and unhurried, was more terrifying than any shout. The X-Men watched the broadcast in the mansion's war room. So did the Guardians of the Globe in their own command center. So did Cecil Stedman in his shadowed office beneath the earth. So did 7 billion ordinary people in kitchens and hospitals and prisons and cars pulled over at the side of highways. Xavier's expression did not change as he listened. Cyclops's did. Wolverine's did. Storm's hand tightened upon the back of Rogue's chair until the wood beneath her fingers cracked. Jean Grey stood very still, her eyes half closed, and murmured that Thrag was not lying, exactly. He believed every word he was saying. That was the horror. He truly believed that his empire had come as gardeners, and that gardeners, when necessary, pulled weeds. The first meeting between Xavier and Thrag was arranged within hours. Neither man used intermediaries. Neither man asked for guarantees of safety. They met in the neutral gardens of a small European estate that had been offered by a nervous prime minister. And they met alone. Thrag came in his black armor. Xavier came in his chair. They sat across from each other at a wrought iron table beneath a flowering tree that had, ironically, been planted the year Xavier was born. A pot of tea stood between them, untouched by either. They spoke for nearly 2 hours. Their conversation was not recorded. No aides sat within earshot. Only the birds heard them, and the wind, and the small crimson blossoms that occasionally drifted down between them as they talked. What passed there would be reconstructed later only through the fragments each man carried out. Thrag spoke of hierarchy. He spoke of the natural order of species, of the way the strong shaped the weak into forms that served everyone's flourishing, of the terrible, wasteful cruelty of allowing lesser beings to govern themselves when guidance was available. He spoke of it not as a tyrant, but as a teacher, and it was that quality, more than any other, that made Xavier's blood run cold. Xavier, for his part, spoke of coexistence. He spoke of 100 generations of his own people who had been told that they were the next step, the natural inheritors, the necessary evolution, and of what those words had done to the world around them. He spoke of the difference between being different and being better, and he spoke of the small, hard-won art of forgiveness, which no empire he had ever studied had bothered to learn. Thrag listened with genuine interest. He did not interrupt. Yet at the end of the conversation, when Xavier had finished, the Grand Regent only inclined his head with the same courtesy he had shown the diplomat in New York, and he said that he found Xavier a magnificent creature, but that magnificence and error were not, in his experience, incompatible. He said that he hoped Xavier would live long enough to enjoy watching his people be improved. He rose then. He inclined his head once more. He walked away across the small stone path, and the flowering tree above the table trembled softly in a wind that had begun to feel colder than the season warranted. While the elders spoke, the young were doing what the young always do. They were finding each other. In a small warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago, a place that had once housed steel and now housed only rust, Mark Grayson and his father embraced for the first time since the highway. They did not speak at first. Nolan looked at his son as if he were memorizing him. Mark held on longer than he had ever intended to. When at last they parted, both of their faces were wet, and neither of them spoke of it. Nolan told his son what he knew of Thrag. He told him of the breeding programs that no history book had ever recorded, of the worlds where Viltrumites had bred with local populations until the local populations no longer existed as anything but distant genetic memory. He told his son that the interest Thrag had shown in the mutants was not, in Viltrumite culture, a compliment. It was a menu. Mark listened without interrupting. When his father finished, Mark asked, in the small, steady voice of a man who was still learning to be one, what they were supposed to do. Nolan did not answer at once. He looked out through the broken warehouse window at a sky that had grown crowded with unfamiliar ships, and after a long silence he said, only that they were going to do what men like them had never quite managed to do before. They were going to stand between the Empire and the innocent, and they were going to keep standing there until either the Empire changed its mind or they themselves stopped being able to stand. Mark, to his own quiet surprise, did not flinch at the words. He simply nodded and rested his hand briefly upon his father's shoulder, and the two of them stood together in the failing warehouse light, like two men on the edge of a very old cliff. That evening, Thrag delivered his ultimatum. He did so from the same podium in New York. He did so with the same courtesy. He said that the Empire had assessed the situation with patience, that the fugitive Mark Grayson was to be delivered to Viltrumite custody within 7 days, and that the population identified by his scholars as mutants was to be presented, voluntarily, at collection sites that would be announced within the following 72 hours. He said that failure to comply with either request would result in what he described, with a small smile, as regrettable municipal consequences. He said that his empire, as always, preferred to garden rather than to burn, but that some soils, unfortunately, could only be improved by the flame. The mansion was very quiet after the broadcast ended. No one spoke for a long time. Kitty. Pride sat on the great stone stairs, her arms around her knees, her face pressed against the cold marble of the balustrade. Nightcrawler stood by the window and prayed silently in 3 languages. Storm looked at the sky and made no clouds. Xavier remained in his chair at the head of the long oak table, his hands folded, his eyes closed, listening to a great many thoughts in a great many minds and unable, for the first time in years, to find any of them comforting. Jean Grey rose without a word and walked from the room. She had felt something new pressing against the seam of the world, and it was neither Viltrumite, nor sentinel, nor human. It was older, it was patient, and it was smiling. Above the mansion, high in the darkening sky, a second rift began, very softly, to open. He did not fall through the rift. He walked. That, of course, was the difference between Eric Laneshare and every other traveler the wound had disgorged into this new reality. Where the frightened girl had tumbled and Nolan had descended and the sentinels had marched, Magneto stepped through the seam of the sky as one might step through the doorway of a familiar house, one hand loose at his side, the other resting lightly upon the hilt of a metal staff that shimmered faintly with an intelligence of its own. His helmet, magenta and battered by 100 wars, sat upon his head as if it had never been removed. His cape stirred in a wind that seemed to know him personally. Behind him came others, not many. He had never needed many. Mystique arrived a step behind his left shoulder, her hair the color of dried autumn leaves, her yellow eyes surveying the new world with the appraising patience of a woman who had spent her lifetime evaluating exits. Sabretooth prowled a pace behind her, teeth showing, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar scents. Exodus, robed in dark red, drifted down beside them without visibly moving, his eyes glowing softly with the certainty of a man who had never once doubted his master. A handful of younger hardliners followed, faces Xavier would not have recognized, drawn from later chapters of Krakoan history that Magneto had personally curated. They were not many. They did not need to be. Magneto had never won his wars through numbers. He surveyed the new sky without hurry. Above him, Viltrumite ships hovered in their patient formations. Around him, the world's ordinary landscape carried on with its ordinary rhythms, oblivious for one more moment to the fact that a new king had arrived. He allowed himself the smallest of smiles, the ghost of a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and he murmured, more to himself than to his companions, that this world was almost embarrassingly generous. A world without sentinels in the historical record. A world without the long-inherited terror of his people. A world in which mutants had no persecutors because mutants had never existed. It was, he thought, the empty canvas he had waited his entire life to paint. His arrival did not go unnoticed. Cerebro flared. Xavier felt him before he had taken his third step. So did Jean. So did every telepath in the mansion. Storm stood up from the chair she had been sharing with Cyclops in the war room and looked out toward the horizon with an expression that no one in the room had seen on her face in a very long time. Wolverine spat. Nightcrawler crossed himself. And Charles Xavier, in the long-practiced calm of a man who had been dreading precisely this moment since the very hour of the rift's opening, folded his hands and closed his eyes and prepared himself to speak with his oldest friend. The reunion, when it came, took place upon the eastern lawn of the mansion. Magneto did not enter the building. He never did. He preferred to have such conversations beneath the open sky, where the elements of the earth remembered his voice. Xavier came out to meet him, his chair humming softly across the grass, and behind him the senior members of the X-Men fanned into a loose semicircle at a respectful distance. Magneto's own small cadre spread across the low hedge line opposite. Mystique's smile did not reach her eyes. Sabretooth's did. Between the two groups, in the small square of trampled grass that neither line had yet crossed, stood only Charles and Eric. They spoke first, as they always did, of nothing, of the weather, of the strange new stars, of an old chess match they had once played in a hospital corridor in Bavaria after a mission neither of them any longer discussed. Their voices were quiet, almost fond. Behind them, watching, their respective factions could not have understood the tenderness that survived between these two men no matter what philosophies they wore. Xavier asked, at last, why Eric had come. Magneto did not pretend not to understand. He said plainly that he had come to claim this world. He said it without bombast. He said it with the calm precision of a physician announcing a diagnosis. He said that this Earth was a fresh manuscript, and that he intended to write upon it the story that his own reality had denied his people. Xavier did not argue at first. He listened. He always listened. He allowed Magneto to speak of the failures of coexistence in every universe he had ever tried it, of the way even the mildest of moderate governments had, sooner or later, sharpened its knives against them, of the terrible mathematics of a species outnumbered 1,000 to 1. He allowed his old friend to speak of a future in which mutants no longer bargained with the men who had once caged them. And when at last Magneto fell silent, Xavier answered, softly, that a world without persecutors was not a world without moral responsibility. He said that Eric had confused an empty stage for permission. He said that even here, especially here, there were still innocents to be protected, still children not their own to be considered. Still choices to be made that could not be reduced to the simple calculus of who had been wronged first. Magneto did not flinch. He never did. Their argument ranged for over an hour. It was not, in the end, an argument that could be won. It was the argument that these two men had been having in one form or another for the whole of their long, shared lifetime, and both of them knew it. What was new was that this time some of the young were listening. Kitty stood at the edge of the lawn with her arms folded, her face troubled. Nightcrawler prayed quietly beneath a nearby tree. Rogue's eyes narrowed each time Magneto spoke a phrase she could not immediately refute. And within the mansion, at a high window overlooking the lawn, a young woman named Ileana leaned upon the sill and thought thoughts she did not wish to admit to her teachers. It was, perhaps, the first time in that reality that Charles Xavier had ever come away from a debate, with Magneto uncertain of how many of his own students would still be beside him by dawn. Later that same night, in an entirely different meeting, Magneto and Mark Grayson stood upon the roof of an abandoned church at the edge of a small Virginia town. Neither of them had told anyone where they were going. Their conversation had been arranged with the quiet economy of two old wolves scenting each other across a field. They stood at opposite corners of the roof at first, saying nothing, letting the wind of the darkening sky do what conversation could not. When at last they spoke, they did so as two men who had survived genocides at opposite ends of the multiverse, each of them a survivor of a system that had believed in his uselessness, each of them, in his own way, an architect of the vengeance that had followed. Nolan spoke of Viltrum, Magneto spoke of the camps. Nolan spoke of what he had done in the name of the Empire before he had learned to question it. Magneto spoke of what he had done in the name of survival long after he had ceased needing to. Their voices were low, their sentences were spare. Neither man attempted to justify himself. Neither man asked to be forgiven. Yet, in the small, quiet spaces between their words, something like recognition passed between them, and it was the recognition of two very old ghosts meeting at last upon a rooftop and discovering that they knew each other's names. When Nolan warned Magneto that the Viltrumite Empire could not be reasoned with, Magneto answered, without hesitation, that neither could he. Nolan considered this for a long time. He looked at the older man with something that was not quite respect and not quite pity, and he said, at last, that he hoped the two of them would not find themselves standing on opposite sides of the coming storm. Magneto answered only that he hoped the same. Meanwhile, in a small side chamber of the mansion, Mark Grayson found himself, without quite understanding how, in a conversation with Magneto's daughter. She had come with her father's cadre, and she had said very little all evening, but she had watched Mark with a quiet, curious intensity throughout the debate on the lawn. Now, standing near a bookshelf, she asked him whether he had ever considered how much simpler his life would become if he stopped trying to save every human who could not save himself. She said it kindly. That was the trouble. She said it with the small, tempting warmth of someone who had thought the thought many times before and had made her peace with it. Mark looked at her for a long moment. He did not answer at once. He felt the seduction of the idea, the clean geometry of it, the way it promised to lift a great and unwelcome weight from his shoulders. Then he thought of his mother. Then he thought of Amber. Then he thought of Kitty Pryde's Coco. He shook his head, gently, and he told her that he was still learning how to be a hero, but he was old enough to know when someone was offering him an excuse instead of a purpose. She smiled at him. It was not, he thought, an unkind smile. It was only sad. Elsewhere in the mansion, at the top of the great staircase, Jean Grey stopped mid-step and pressed her hand against her chest. Something inside her, something she had not felt this strongly in years, had begun to sing. The Phoenix did not arrive. That was the first thing anyone who had ever known it needed to understand. The Phoenix had never arrived. It had only ever remembered that it was already there. It slept in Jean Grey the way certain rivers sleep beneath deserts, silent for centuries at a time, then, in the smallest of moments, breaking to the surface in a flood that reshaped every stone it touched. On the night after Magneto's coming, it broke. It broke slowly. It broke with an old, weary tenderness that surprised even Jean herself. She stood upon the top step of the mansion's grand staircase with her hand pressed against her chest, and she felt, rather than saw, the ember at the center of her sternum brighten into a small, patient sun. She did not fight it. She had not fought it in years. She only breathed, and she listened, and she permitted the Phoenix to open its ancient eyes within her. What she saw then was too vast for language. The corridors of the mansion vanished. The floor beneath her feet vanished. Even the outline of her own body vanished. She stood, or seemed to stand, in a place that was made of memory and firelight, and around her, the Phoenix unfolded the true history of every mutant who had ever lived in her home reality. She saw children she had never met. She saw the old man who had died in the streets of Marseille the year she was born. She saw a woman in Nairobi who had loved wind before she had ever loved a person. She saw the small, forgotten ones, the ones who had never been named in any textbook, the ones whose lives had ended before their gifts had ever been given a chance to matter. The Phoenix showed her each of them in turn, patient, unhurried, and it whispered that these were the ones she carried, and that carrying them was neither a burden nor a punishment. It was the meaning of her fire. Then the Phoenix turned her gaze outward, past the walls of her own reality, and showed her what the Viltrumite Empire had done. She saw worlds without number, some of them still remembered by their neighbors, most of them long since forgotten even by their own stars. She saw green planets turned brown, blue oceans turned red, the singing places of 100 civilizations reduced to silent stone. She saw the Empire's methodical patience. She saw its calm, unshakable belief that this was mercy. She saw Thrag himself, standing above a city that no longer had a name, murmuring in his even voice that the survivors would be grateful in a generation. The Phoenix did not ask her to weep for these worlds. It only asked her to remember them, so she did. And then, at last, the Phoenix showed her the pattern. It was there, in every ruin she had just witnessed. In every scar the Empire had left, in every genocide her own reality had recorded. It was there in the timing of the Scarlet Witch's grief. It was there in the small, subtle currents of the failed Viltrumite experiment. It was there in the quiet whisper that had first suggested to Cecil Stedman that he study the X-gene, in the careful nudge that had turned Thrag's curiosity toward this particular Earth, in the almost imperceptible tilt that had led Magneto's rift to open exactly where it had. Everything, when viewed from the height at which the Phoenix flew, formed one long, deliberate composition. And at its center, patient as a spider in a very large web, sat something that had been waiting for a very long time. The Phoenix hissed a name that Jean Grey could not translate into any human syllable. It named the thing not once but 7 times, in 7 older languages, and each utterance stripped away a further layer of illusion, until at last Jean understood that the creature at the center of the web had no name at all in the tongue of any living species. She would have to invent one for it. She would have to name it in a way that its future victims could remember. She thought of the way her Phoenix song had always sounded like many voices at once. She thought of the emptiness that lay behind that harmony when the Phoenix was starved. She named the thing, quietly, the Hollow Choir. The name would not be forgotten. When Jean returned to herself, she was kneeling upon the floor of the mansion's landing. Scott was beside her, one hand upon her back, his face pale and steady. Xavier's chair had rolled to the base of the stairs. Storm stood at the far end of the corridor, arms folded across her chest, watching without a word. Jean stood slowly, and she did not need to explain to any of them what had happened. They had all felt it, in their different ways. She only said, softly, that the rift was not an accident. She said the name aloud. She said that this crossover, all of it from the Scarlet Witch's sorrow to Thrag's arrival, had been curated by a creature that fed upon precisely such collisions. She said that if the 2 universes continued to bleed into each other, the Hollow Choir would devour them both. Before any of them could answer, the sirens began. Thrag had begun to lose patience. His ultimatum still had days to run, but the Grand Regent, watching from his flagship high above the atmosphere, had grown displeased with the pace of what he considered the human negotiation. He had chosen to demonstrate his patience by ending it. He selected, with the unhurried care of a man choosing wine, a small city upon the western coast of North America. It was not important. That was the point. It had a population of some 400,000 souls, a modest port, a small tradition of art. He signaled to his lieutenant. The lieutenant descended alone. The city was gone within 17 minutes. There was no announcement. There was only, on every television in every corner of the world, the sudden, silent replacement of the ordinary programming with a slow aerial view of a place that no longer existed. The X-Men mobilized within moments. So did the Guardians. So did Magneto. So did, though he could not yet be seen, Nolan Grayson. The convergence that followed had not been planned by any of them, and yet, in the strange gravity of moments such as this, it fell into place with the quiet inevitability of a chord resolving. The heroes of 2 universes, and the villains of one, and the exiles of both, converged upon the site of the fallen city because none of them could bear not to. Even Magneto's hardliners, who had spoken hours earlier of the wisdom of letting humans learn their limits, arrived at the perimeter of the ash and did not speak of learning at all. They only stood, they only looked, and then, without instruction, they began to help. They dug. They lifted rubble. They carried the dying. They searched for those still breathing beneath the fallen concrete. Rogue found a child in the crook of a shattered stairwell and carried her out with a tenderness that did not match her borrowed strength. Rex Splode wept openly for the first time in his life. Nightcrawler moved through the ruins like a small blue prayer, teleporting the trap to open air a dozen at a time. Storm coaxed the wind to carry away the toxic smoke so that the surviving lungs beneath could breathe. Cyclops burned careful, precise channels through debris that no crane could have moved. Mark and Nolan fought side by side to lift a fallen overpass so that ambulances could pass, and for the first time since the highway, the son looked at his father not as a wound, but as a partner. It was then, in the middle of that quiet, terrible labor, that Jean Grey rose above the ruined city and the Phoenix rose with her. She did not shout. She did not command. She only ignited. Her fire did not burn what remained of the city. It burned instead within the eyes of every hero and every villain and every rescuer upon the site. It burned within the eyes of every human watching upon every screen. It burned as a message, wordless, ancient, and utterly clear. She showed them the pattern. She showed them the hollow choir. She showed them the true architect of everything that had befallen them since the first tremor. When she at last allowed the vision to fade, and when she at last descended back among them, she found that no one, not even Magneto, could quite look at her the same way again. Her voice, when she spoke, was her own. Yet behind it, softer than an echo, there was a second voice, older than any of them, and it named the enemy one final time. Above the ash, the sky above every capital of the world began, very softly, to crack. At first, it looked like weather. In Tokyo, ordinary citizens paused on their walks home and glanced up at the sky and thought, only for a moment, that the horizon had grown a strange new color. In Cairo, a taxi driver frowned through his windshield at what appeared to be an odd shimmer in the air above the Nile. In Rio, a young couple on a rooftop stopped kissing to look, together, at what seemed to be a hairline fracture running slowly across the heavens. Then the fracture spoke. It did not speak in language. It spoke in absence. The world learned, in that instant, what silence sounded like when it had teeth. The hollow choir did not descend so much as it excreted itself. From the growing cracks in the sky, long, pale tendrils began to unfurl, translucent and vast, each one segmented like the leg of some enormous marine creature that had crawled out of an ocean that was not water. They did not touch the earth at first. They only tasted it, brushing lightly against rooftops, against forests, against the tips of mountains. Wherever they brushed, everything ordinary went slightly wrong. Colors dulled, sounds thinned, time stuttered. A woman in Marseille reached to close a window and found that her arm had already been there for what felt like several minutes, though her clock had barely moved. A child in Sydney laughed once at a birthday party and then could not remember what had been funny, though the party continued around him and no one else seemed to have noticed. Jean Grey named it aloud one final time. She called it the hollow choir, and this time even the untelepathic could hear her, because the phoenix had folded her voice around the syllables and spoken them into every mind on earth at once. She told them what it was. She told them what it wanted. And she told them, with a calm that was neither optimism nor despair, that it would not stop until they made it stop. The war that followed did not resemble any war either universe had fought before. It could not be waged in a single place. The hollow choir was not a single place. It was everywhere at once, in every crack of the sky, in every dulled color, in every stuttering moment. So the heroes of two universes fanned outward, and for the first time in either of their histories, they fought as one connected organism rather than as separate teams. Cyclops, from a mobile command post that Beast and Robot had assembled in less than an hour, coordinated the world's response with a precision that even Cecil Stedman, watching from his own console, found himself grudgingly admiring. Xavier held the psychic net, weaving each hero's mind into a shared web of awareness so that no one, on any continent, ever fought alone. Jean Grey burned like a small second sun above the mansion, feeding strength through the web whenever any fighter faltered. Storm and Monster Girl were dispatched to Southeast Asia, where a tendril had begun to feed upon the population of a coastal city. Storm blackened the sky with a hurricane that took her 3 hours to shape, and Monster Girl, snarling with a body far larger than the child she had once been, tore into the tendril with a savagery that surprised even Storm. Together they collapsed evacuation corridors so that families could flee before the tendril adapted to their attacks. When at last Storm carried the exhausted Monster Girl on the wind toward the next front, the small warrior girl smiled up at her and said, softly, that she had always wanted to fly. Storm smiled back and did not tell her that she was already flying. Cyclops and Rex explode coordinated long-range strikes from a burning ridge in the Alps. It was an unlikely partnership. Rex's crude, brawling humor at first grated against Scott's tight, disciplined command style. Yet within an hour they had found each other's rhythms, and by the time the third tendril fell across the Mediterranean, they were exchanging targeting data with the easy confidence of soldiers who had trained together for years. When Rex, halfway through a difficult calculation, muttered that he had never before enjoyed being bossed around, Scott, without looking away from his display, replied that he had never before enjoyed being cursed at during a firefight. They did not laugh. They did not have the time. But something between them, small and hard and lasting, was forged upon that ridge. Nightcrawler and Kitty Pryde undertook the most dangerous assignment. The Phoenix had determined that the Hollow Choir's physical shell was not fully formed. It was still gathering itself, still knitting a body from the debris of two universes, and there was a moment, brief but real, in which its unborn form could be infiltrated. Kitty phased through the outer membrane of the shell with Nightcrawler pressed against her back, and once inside, the two of them moved through corridors that were not corridors, past organs that were not organs, toward a great central chamber where the Hollow Choir's growing awareness pulsed like a slow, thoughtful heart. They did not attempt to destroy it. That was not their purpose. They had come to plant something that Beast and Robot had built, a small device carrying a psychic beacon that Jean Grey herself had helped design, a signal that would pin the creature's attention long enough for the other fronts to strike. Kitty placed it, quietly, upon the pulsing thing at the center. Nightcrawler prayed a short, fierce prayer. Then he took her hand, and they were gone in a flash of purple smoke, and behind them the Hollow Choir shuddered as it discovered, for the first time in its very long existence, that it had been touched by something it had not chosen to feel. Mark and Nolan fought together over Los Angeles. The city was already partially in ruins, and the tendril that had fastened above it was among the largest on the planet. Father and son struck it in tandem, each blow reinforcing the other, each maneuver flowing into the next, as though they had trained together their entire lives. In truth, they had trained together their entire lives, though most of that training had been for very different purposes. It was during the second hour of the engagement, hovering shoulder to shoulder above the ruined harbor while the tendril writhed beneath them, that Nolan turned to his son and spoke, without ceremony, of the wrongs he had done. He did not weep. He did not apologize in the small, insufficient ways that words allow. He simply named them, each one. He named the highway. He named the train. He named the day he had struck his son. And Mark listened, hovering there in the smoke, and when his father had finished, Mark reached across the small space between them and rested his hand upon his father's shoulder. It was not forgiveness. Both of them knew that. It was something older. It was the recognition that the road forward, whatever it turned out to be, would be walked together. Then they turned back toward the tendril, and they struck it again as one. The most improbable moment of the war, however, took place upon the roof of the mansion itself. Xavier had gone up to consult with Jean, and Magneto, without warning, had descended from the sky and landed beside him. The old friends did not speak at first. They only watched the horizon, where a distant tendril thrashed above the coast. Then, slowly, wordlessly, they turned back to back. Xavier extended his mind. Magneto extended his hand. Between them, telepathic net and magnetokinetic field braided together into a shield that no single universe's science would ever quite understand. It was not merely a shield. It was, in its way, an argument. It was two men who had spent their lives believing in incompatible futures, discovering, at last, that the only future either of them cared about was one in which the other continued to exist to argue with them. When at last the tendril fell, Magneto turned to Xavier and inclined his head, very slightly. Xavier inclined his in return. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Yet, even as the fronts held, even as the tendrils fell one by one, the truth revealed itself with a slow, sickening clarity. The Hollow Choir was not being defeated. It was only being delayed. For every tendril the heroes severed, another began to form. For every city they saved, another dulled. It was Beast, watching the data scroll across his screen at 3 a.m, who finally spoke aloud what all of them had begun to suspect. The Hollow Choir could not be killed by force. It could only be starved. It fed upon the collision of the two universes. As long as the rift existed, the creature had a food source. And as long as it had a food source, it could grow tendrils faster than any army could sever them. Xavier gathered them, all of them, at the mansion by dawn. X-Men, Guardians, Mutants, and Viltrumites, hardliners and moderates, Cecil Stedman in a folding chair at the back of the great hall, his hat in his hands. Jean Grey stood at the head of the table, the phoenix quiet within her, and she looked at every face in the room with an expression that was gentle and unflinching. She said that they had learned the enemy's weakness. She said that they now knew what had to be done. And she said, softly, that the price would be very high. and that no one in that room would leave it the same. Then she began, quietly, to explain. She spoke without ceremony. The Phoenix had taught her, over the long years of their bonding, that certain truths deserved plainness above all else, and this truth was among them. She stood at the head of the mansion's great hall in the pale, gray light of a morning that had not yet decided whether to become a proper day, and she looked at each of them in turn, at Xavier, at Scott, at Storm, at Wolverine, at Nightcrawler and Kitty, at Rogue and Beast, at Mark, at Nolan, at Magneto and Mystique, and even at Cecil. And she said that the hollow choir could only be starved by the sealing of the rift. She said that the rift could not be sealed from either side alone. It required a keeper. She said that someone would have to remain within the wound itself, holding it closed from within, and that whoever remained would not return. The room was very quiet for a long time. It was Xavier who spoke first. He said, in the calm voice of a man who had rehearsed the words in the privacy of his own mind for hours, that he would go. He said it with the small, apologetic smile of a teacher who had, at last, come to the natural end of his lesson. He said that his dream had always required someone willing to pay for it, and that he could not, in good conscience, ask any of his students to bear a cost he had not first offered to bear himself. He was almost finished speaking when Jean Grey lifted her hand, gently, and shook her head. She said softly that his dream had to outlive him. She said it not as a student contradicting her teacher, but as a daughter refusing to bury her father. She said that if he stepped into the wound, the world he had spent his life building would collapse behind him, because there was no one else in either universe who could hold that particular dream, together with the delicate, patient hands that he had spent decades training. She said that his part in the story was not yet finished. She said it kindly. Xavier, for a long moment, could not speak. Then he inclined his head, the smallest of concessions, and he closed his eyes, and he permitted the argument to move on. It was Nolan who spoke next. He rose to his feet in the back of the hall, his cape drifting slightly, his face set in the calm mask he had worn in 100 battles. He said that he had spent centuries as a soldier of a system that had used other worlds as raw material for its own ambitions. He said that no amount of penance in this life could balance the ledger he had built. He said that if there existed a chance to close a wound in the multiverse with his own life, he would gladly step into it and count himself luckier than he deserved. Mark, seated near the front of the hall, went very pale. He rose slowly. He did not raise his voice. He said simply that he had only just gotten his father back. He said that if the price of saving the world was losing his father a second time, then someone else would have to find another price. He said it without anger. He said it without accusation. He said it in the small, steady voice of a son who had made his own peace, at last, with the messy weight of loving a man who had wronged him. Nolan looked at his son for a long moment, and then he sat down, and he did not speak again. It was, of all people, Magneto who spoke next. He rose from his chair with the slow economy of a man who had known for some hours that this was the choice he would offer. He said that he had, in his long life, done a great many things that could not be undone, and that he had grown weary of the elaborate architecture of half-apologies with which he had tried to live with them. He said that a man who had done what he had done deserved an ending that finally meant something. He said it without theatricality. He said it without self-pity. He said it, in fact, in a voice that Xavier had not heard from his old friend in 50 years. The voice of the young man Xavier had met on a rocky beach beneath a rising ship before either of them had learned to weaponize the word never. Xavier looked at him across the hall, and something in the old telepath's expression cracked open in a way that no one in that room had ever quite seen before. Jean Grey allowed the offers to stand for a long moment. She honored each of them by considering it in silence. Then, without hurry, she said that none of them could be the keeper. She said that the wound in the multiverse could only be held closed from within by a being that partially existed outside of time. She said that a mortal keeper, no matter how strong, would be devoured by the flow of dimensional entropy within the first minute. She said that the only being in either universe suited to the task was already standing in front of them. The Phoenix quietly opened its eyes behind her own, and every telepath in the room felt the room grow warmer by a single patient degree. Scott Summers rose slowly to his feet. He did not speak at first. He walked, without ceremony, across the length of the hall to where his wife stood at the head of the long table, and he took her hands in his. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. Around them, the room did what rooms always do when they witness such things. It made itself small. Every gaze fell politely to the floor. Every breath was held. Scott, at last, spoke to Jean in a voice that only she could hear, and Jean answered him in the same. Whatever passed between them in those minutes was not recorded, and neither Xavier nor Charles, nor even the phoenix within her, ever chose to speak of it afterward. When at last they parted, both of their faces were wet, and neither of them made any attempt to pretend otherwise. Scott did not ask her to reconsider. He had lived beside her too long for that. He only rested his forehead against hers for the space of 3 breaths, and then he stepped back, and he nodded, and he allowed her to go. While the heroes gathered themselves for the final ride, Thrag made his own final move. He had been watching all of it from the great flagship high above the atmosphere, and he had drawn, from the pattern of their preparations, precisely the correct conclusion. He understood that the rift was about to be sealed. He understood that if it were sealed, his empire would lose forever its access to the genetic resources of the mutants. He resolved, therefore, to seize the rift for the empire, to keep it open, to weaponize the very wound the hollow choir had been feeding upon. He descended in person with a strike guard of the empire's finest. He did not descend to the mansion. He descended to the site of the wound itself, high above the New York forest, where the very first fissure had opened all those weeks before. The convergence that followed was the last great battle of the story. Every hero of both universes rallied to the site. Every villain who had joined the cause rallied with them. Even Cecil Stedman, in a black flight suit that no one had seen him wear in a decade, arrived at the head of a strike force of his own, his face unreadable. Above them, the sky churned with unfinished tendrils and Viltrumite fighters, and the great burning form of the Phoenix. Storm called down a lattice of lightning to break Thrag's formations. Rogue absorbed the strength of 3 Viltrumite officers in as many minutes and turned it against their own comrades. Cyclops and Rexplode, back to back, cut clean lines through the enemy air with a coordination that would be remembered, in both universes, for decades. Wolverine and Sabretooth, side by side for the first time in either of their long lives, tore into a squad of Viltrumite lieutenants, with a joy that neither of them had entirely known they still possessed. Magneto lifted an entire fleet's worth of alloy debris into a hovering wall of metal that shielded the mansion's evacuation transports. Nightcrawler ferried the wounded to safety in short, prayerful jumps. Kitty Pryde phased through Thrag's flagship and disabled its main cannon from within, whispering apologies to the ship's engineers as she passed through them. Mark and Nolan met Thrag himself in the sky above the rift. The battle between the 3 of them lasted 17 minutes and would be reconstructed by historians for a century. In the end, it was not Nolan who struck the decisive blow, nor Mark alone, but the 2 of them together, father and son, one strike beginning where the other ended, one motion completing the other. Thrag fell back, wounded, into the arms of his personal guard, and his flagship, its cannon disabled, retreated with him in a slow, humiliated arc back toward the outer atmosphere. He did not, in that hour, say the words that would have ended his empire, but the world had watched him retreat, and the watching would be enough. Jean Grey stepped into the wound at last. She turned, once, at the very edge of it, and she looked back at all of them. Her face, in the light of the Phoenix, was young again and old again, and simply hers. She did not speak, she only smiled. And then she was gone, into a light that even the Phoenix seemed to bow toward, and above the forest of New York, the sky at last began, very slowly, to close. The morning after the sealing came softly, as if the world itself had grown suddenly unwilling to interrupt whatever grief the survivors carried. There were no ceremonies. There were no addresses. In every city that had been touched, ordinary people simply rose from their beds and moved to their windows, and looked up at a sky that no longer cracked. Some of them wept, some of them prayed. Most of them stood in silence for a long time and then, slowly, returned to the small, ordinary tasks of a life that had been given back to them by strangers whose names they would never fully know. The mansion returned to its own reality without spectacle. It simply was, one moment, standing upon the strange hillside of the Invincible universe, and then, the next, resting again in the familiar green of Westchester as though it had never left. Its inhabitants, however, did not all return with it. That had been agreed upon in the long, quiet conversations of the final hours, when each mutant had been given the choice, freely and without pressure, to remain in the world they had come to know or to return to the world they had come from. Some went home, most did, yet others chose to stay, and the choosing of it was as varied and personal as any decision that mattered. Kitty, Pride, chose to stay. She had spent her last week walking the streets of Chicago at Mark Grayson's side, and she had come to understand, in a way that had surprised her, that this new Earth needed a certain kind of teacher, and that she was, for perhaps the first time in her young life, ready to become one. Nightcrawler stayed with her. He had prayed for guidance in 3 languages and had received his answer in a 4th, and he had gathered a handful of the younger mutants around him, including the frightened girl who had first fallen through the rift, and he had promised them that they would build, together, a small school upon the outskirts of that world. Its doors would open in autumn. Its students would come slowly, at first, but they would come. Xavier did not stay. He had considered it. He had considered it more seriously than any of his students realized. Yet in the end he had understood, with the same clarity that had led him to accept Jean's refusal, that his own reality still needed him. He returned to Westchester with the majority of the senior team, and he took Scott Summers home with the same quiet tenderness with which he had once taken him in as a boy. Scott did not weep on the flight back. He had already wept, and he would weep again, and he would learn, over the years to come, that grief for someone one has loved deeply does not resolve so much as it settles, and that its settling becomes, in time, its own kind of company. That first night home he walked the halls of the mansion alone, and he stood for a long while in the small greenhouse that had been Jean's favorite, and he listened for her, and he did not hear her, and he understood that this too was part of what it meant to have loved her at all. Nolan Grayson chose exile a second time, though this time it was a very different exile from the one he had once served. He came to Mark on a rooftop 3 nights after the sealing, and he told his son, without preamble, that he could not remain on Earth. He said that his history, no matter how much repentance he offered, would forever be a shadow upon his son's own hard-won reputation. He said that the world Mark was learning to protect deserved a hero unshadowed by a father's crimes. Yet he said, too, that he did not intend to vanish. He said that he would take up watch upon the far edges of the Empire's reach, as a guardian rather than a fugitive, and that if his son ever needed him, the sky would carry the message quickly enough. Mark did not argue. He had learned, at last, when to argue with his father and when to allow his father to be what his father needed to be. They embraced upon the rooftop, and when Nolan lifted at last from the ledge, Mark watched him rise until his father was only a small, dark shape against the stars, and then, not even that. Cecil Stedman closed the mutant research files at his own hand. He did so at the very end of a very long night, alone in his office beneath the earth. He read each of them a final time. He set them, one by one, into a black box upon his desk. He did not destroy them. He also did not archive them in the general vaults. He locked the box with a personal code and placed it in a private safe whose only combination he committed to memory. Whether he intended, in time, to burn them or to open them again, he did not tell himself. He was too tired for such distinctions. He was, if only for one long minute, simply a man in a small office beneath the earth listening to the quiet hum of his own machinery. He lit a cigarette. He did not smoke it. He let it burn down between his fingers and watched the ember travel. And when at last the ember had gone out, he stood, and he went home, and he did not answer his telephone for 2 days. Magneto returned to Krakoa in the same silence with which he had first arrived through the rift. His hardliners came with him, though the manner in which they walked behind him had changed. They followed him more quietly now. They spoke less. He had said very little to any of them in the hours after the sealing, and none of them had pressed him. He walked the shores of the mutant island for many days without speaking to anyone, and when at last he sat down beside a young mutant on the sand and spoke, he did so in a voice his followers had never heard from him. He asked her, gently, what she was reading. She looked up from her book, startled, and then she showed him the cover, and he nodded slowly and said, only that it was a fine book, and that he hoped she was enjoying it. She said she was. He said he was glad. Then he rose, and he walked further along the shore, and behind him she watched him go with an expression that would, in later years, become the expression of an entire generation of Krakoni children when they spoke of him. Storm remained close to Scott in the mansion. She said little. She did not need to. She was the kind of friend who knew how to sit in a room without filling it. Wolverine, who had never known quite what to do with grief, dealt with it as he dealt with all difficult things, by making himself useful in small ways that no one thanked him for. He mended a fence. He cleaned the hangar. He sharpened every blade in the training room until the edges could split falling silk. Rogue took long walks through the woods and returned each afternoon looking a little lighter than she had that morning. Beast wrote a paper he never intended to publish. Nightcrawler, in his new school across the rift, taught his students on their very first day a small song in 3 languages, and they learned it, and they carried it home to their parents, and slowly, through the odd, quiet mercies of the young, the song spread. Mark Grayson stood on a rooftop at dawn, some weeks later, and watched the sun come up over Chicago. The city had rebuilt what it could. Some of what it had lost would never be rebuilt. He had learned in the strange, awkward way of the young who have witnessed too much, that this was simply the truth of the world he had inherited. He would not solve it. He would only, day by day, refuse to abandon it. He thought of his father, watching from somewhere far beyond the atmosphere. He thought of Kitty and Nightcrawler, teaching their new students in the countryside outside the city. He thought of Jean Grey, whom he had barely known and yet who had, in her last hour, looked at him with the same kindness she had looked at everyone. And there, on that quiet rooftop in the first gold light of the day, he heard, or thought he heard, a small sound upon the wind that did not belong to the ordinary murmurs of a waking city. It sounded, if he had been asked to describe it, like fire and forgiveness at once. It lasted only a heartbeat. Then it was gone. He smiled anyway, because he understood, in the small, unspeaking way that heroes eventually come to understand such things, that some voices do not leave. They only wait until the wind is ready to carry them, and then they speak, and then they wait again. 2 worlds had touched, 2 worlds had parted, and the sky above them both, forever after, would remember.